What if I told you that an airplane vanished from radar screens in 1955, only to land safely 37 years later with all passengers still alive and unaged, then disappeared again without a trace? This isn't science fiction. This is the story of Pan American Flight 914, and it will challenge everything you think you know about time, space, and reality itself. Picture this: July 2nd, 1955, New York to Miami, a routine flight that should have taken 3 hours. Pan American Flight 914 takes off with 57 passengers aboard, climbing into clear blue skies. Air traffic controllers track the aircraft as it follows its designated flight path. Then, without warning, the plane simply vanishes. No distress signal, no radio contact, nothing. Search and rescue teams scour the Atlantic Ocean for weeks. The Coast Guard launches the largest search operation in aviation history at that time. They find absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no life preservers. It's as if Flight 914 had been erased from existence. The families of 57 people are left with unanswered questions. The case goes cold. The world moves on. But here's where this story takes an impossible turn. Caracas, Venezuela. September 9th, 1992. Air traffic controllers at Simon Bolivar International Airport are monitoring routine morning traffic when an unidentified aircraft appears on their radar screens. The plane is approaching without having filed a flight plan, without radio contact, and without any identification. Protocol demands immediate action. The control tower attempts radio contact. Static. More attempts. Finally, a crackling voice comes through the speakers, speaking English with an American accent. The pilot identifies himself as Captain Dan Morrison of Pan American Flight 914, requesting permission to land. He states his departure point as New York and his destination as Miami. The air traffic controllers are confused. This is Venezuela, not Florida. More concerning, Pan American Airways had ceased operations years earlier. But the voice sounds genuine, professional, exactly like a commercial airline pilot should sound. Against all logic, they grant landing permission. What happened next defies rational explanation. The aircraft that touched down on the runway was a Lockheed L-049 Constellation, a model that hadn't been in commercial service for decades. The plane appeared to be in pristine condition, as if it had just rolled off the assembly line. No wear, no aging, no signs of the 37 years it had supposedly been missing. Ground crew approached the aircraft with extreme caution. The engines were still running. Through the cockpit windows, they could see the flight crew going through their normal post-landing procedures. Everything appeared completely normal, except for one impossible fact. This airplane was supposed to have disappeared in 1955. A passenger door opened. Captain Morrison stepped out, appearing to be exactly the same age as described in the 1955 missing persons reports. He wore the standard Pan American uniform of the 1950s, perfectly pressed and clean. Behind him emerged 56 passengers, all appearing exactly as they had been described 37 years earlier. No aging, no confusion about the time that had passed. To them, the flight had lasted only a few hours. When airport officials approached Captain Morrison with questions about the 37-year gap, his response was chilling. He checked his watch, looked around at the modern airport facilities, and asked a simple question. "What year is this?" When told it was 1992, the color drained from his face. He examined a newspaper handed to him by an airport worker, staring at the date in disbelief. The passengers began to disembark, chatting among themselves about their brief flight from New York. They commented on the strange appearance of the airport, the unfamiliar uniforms of the ground crew, and the odd-looking vehicles on the tarmac. Some pulled out newspapers they had purchased in New York that morning, dated July 2nd, 1955. The ink was still fresh. Airport authorities immediately contacted aviation officials, government agencies, and international authorities. This wasn't just a missing plane case anymore. This was something that challenged the fundamental laws of physics and time itself. Security footage captured everything, but officials were sworn to secrecy while investigations began. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a physicist working with the Venezuelan government, was called to the scene. Years later, she would describe the experience as the most unsettling moment of her scientific career. She conducted preliminary interviews with several passengers. Each one provided consistent accounts of their journey, a normal takeoff from New York, routine flight conditions, and what felt like a typical 3-hour flight to Miami. When shown photographs of their families as they appeared in 1992, many passengers broke down. Children they remembered as toddlers were now middle-aged adults. Spouses had remarried, thinking them dead. The world had moved on without them, yet they had experienced no passage of time whatsoever. But the story doesn't end there. After 6 hours on the ground in Caracas, during which investigators documented everything possible, Captain Morrison announced that they needed to continue to their original destination. Despite protests from authorities, he insisted that his passengers needed to reach Miami. The investigation was far from complete, but Morrison seemed driven by an inexplicable urgency to complete the original flight plan. Against all recommendations, Venezuelan authorities allowed the aircraft to depart. They had no legal grounds to detain American citizens who had committed no crime and were technically just passengers on a delayed flight. Flight 914 was cleared for takeoff to Miami. The Lockheed Constellation taxied to the runway, its engines creating the distinctive sound that aviation enthusiasts hadn't heard in commercial service for decades. Air traffic controllers maintained radio contact as the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted off into the afternoon sky. They tracked it on radar as it climbed to cruising altitude and headed northwest toward Florida. Then, exactly as it had 37 years earlier, Pan American Flight 914 simply vanished. One moment it was clearly visible on radar screens, the next moment there was nothing. No distress call, no radio contact, no trace of the aircraft. Miami International Airport had been notified and was prepared for their arrival, but Flight 914 never appeared on their radar. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately, but once again, they found nothing. The passengers, the crew, and the aircraft had vanished for a second time. The Venezuelan government classified the incident. Official reports were sealed. The few airport workers and officials who witnessed the events were sworn to secrecy under national security provisions. Dr. Rodriguez's research notes were confiscated. The security footage disappeared into classified archives. But stories have a way of leaking out. Over the years, fragments of the account began to surface. Former airport employees, speaking anonymously, confirmed the basic details. Retired air traffic controllers verified the radar contacts. Family members of the original passengers reported receiving mysterious phone calls in 1992, with voices they recognized as their missing loved ones, claiming to have just landed safely and would be home soon. The implications of Flight 914's story are staggering. If true, it suggests that our understanding of time, space, and reality is fundamentally incomplete. The aircraft appeared to have experienced some form of temporal displacement, existing in a bubble where 37 years passed in the outside world, while only hours passed for those aboard the plane. Scientists have proposed various theories. Some suggest the plane encountered a time anomaly, possibly related to electromagnetic disturbances in the atmosphere. Others point to theoretical physics concepts like closed time-like curves or wormholes that could theoretically allow for such temporal displacement. Skeptics argue that the entire story is an elaborate hoax, despite the multiple corroborating accounts. What makes this case particularly compelling is the consistency of the accounts and the specific details that have emerged over the years. The aircraft type, the flight number, the passenger count, and even the crew names all correspond to actual Pan American records from 1955. The description of the passengers' belongings, their dated newspapers, and their lack of aging all align with what would be expected if they had truly experienced a time slip. The mystery deepened when researchers discovered that several other aircraft disappearances from the 1950s shared similar characteristics. Planes that vanished without explanation, often in clear weather with no distress signals, leaving no trace despite extensive search efforts. While none of these other aircraft ever reappeared, the pattern suggests that Flight 914 might not have been an isolated incident. Modern aviation experts have analyzed the case from every angle. The Lockheed L-049 Constellation was known for its reliability, but by 1955, it was already being replaced by more advanced aircraft. The specific plane involved in this incident, according to records, had completed thousands of flight hours without major incidents. There was nothing in its maintenance history to suggest any problems that could explain a 37-year disappearance. The psychological impact on the passengers' families adds another layer to this mystery. Many had spent decades grieving their lost loved ones, only to receive tantalizing glimpses of hope in 1992. Phone calls that lasted only seconds before the lines went dead. Voices that sounded exactly like their missing family members, unchanged by time. The emotional toll of these brief contacts, followed by another diss.